When the chandeliers blaze and the violins swell, Pittsburgh holds its breath. In a winter ballroom of silk and whispered scorn, the overlooked elder sister stands unseen, until a powerful banker crosses the floor and stops the music. One waltz, one choice, and a city's script shatters. Behind the gaslight shimmer lies a ledger of lies, a past that refuses to stay buried, and a heartbeat pulled between duty and desire. What begins as a courtesy becomes a reckoning, and every glance is a promise or a threat. Tell me where you're listening from, what city, what cozy corner, and share this. In your favorite period romances, do you root for duty's safety or desire's risk? Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, winter of 1884. Outside the marble-pillared assembly hall, the soot-laced snow fell in a steady hush, softening the harsh edges of a city built on iron and fire. Inside, the hall blazed with gaslight and grandeur. Dozens of glittering chandeliers trembled faintly with each footfall on the polished oak floors, casting golden halos over velvet gowns, silk lapels, and the silver-threaded dreams of mothers who had raised daughters for nights like this. Lila Davenport had not come to dance. She stood near the back of the room, partially hidden behind a garland-wrapped column, her gloved hands clasped before her. Her gown, a deep burgundy silk reworked from her mother's trousseau, bore the faint scent of lavender sachets and the weight of altered seams. The lace collar brushed her jaw, and the pearl drop pendant, nestled modestly at her throat, caught a flicker of candlelight, then disappeared again. She had pinned her dark brown hair in a low chignon, parted carefully down the center with no curls to soften the severity. In her mind, softness had long ceased to serve her. She watched her sister spin beneath the gaslights, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with conquest. Clara's powder blue gown shimmered with each step, the bustle artfully exaggerated, the neckline scandalously square. She was laughter and charm, the very image of what society rewarded. Men circled her like moths to a flame. Lila had escorted Clara here for the season's final ball, the winter assembly, expecting little more than a long night of shadows and polite obscurity. For years now, she had learned how to disappear. It was safer that way, quieter, easier on the heart. The elder daughter, the responsible one, the woman too serious, too silent, too something. The music swelled, a Strauss waltz rising like mist over the ballroom. The chandeliers glinted against a ceiling, painted with faded cherubs and golden filigree. The crowd began to part, not with ceremony but with murmurs, like wind through dry leaves. Heads turned, fans paused mid-flutter. Jonathan Markham was moving. The banker was a commanding presence, not because of theatrics, but because of stillness. In rooms filled with peacocks, he was the thundercloud that held the storm. Tonight, he wore a black tailcoat with satin lapels, a white pique waistcoat, and gloves so precisely tailored they seemed like skin. His dark hair, parted with a surgeon's precision, reflected just a whisper of the chandelier's fire. At his vest glinted a gold pocket watch, quiet power in a city that bowed to coin. But it was his eyes, hazel green, cool, unreadable, that made the room hesitate. Lila froze. He was walking toward her, Not toward the bloom of pastels and ostrich feathers at the center of the dance floor. Not toward Clara, who stood breathless, one gloved hand already extended in expectation. No, toward her. Each step he took felt impossible, as if she were dreaming in velvet and lace. She glanced behind her to see if someone else had arrived. No one stood there. He stopped before her, tall and unnervingly composed, and extended his hand. "Miss Davenport," he said, the baritone of his voice quiet, but it cut through the music all the same. "May I have this dance?" Lila's breath caught. There was no amusement in his face, no mockery, no drunken gleam, only precision, stillness, and something else. Something that made the base of her throat grow warm. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked at Clara. Her sister's expression had cracked, confusion curdled into something darker, harder. Lila looked back at Jonathan. "You may," she said, barely louder than a whisper. He took her hand, and the orchestra, trained like bloodhounds to social cues, picked up again. As they moved toward the center of the floor, Lila felt dozens of eyes anchor themselves to her back like pins. The air grew dense with disbelief, with unspoken questions, with rising tides of speculation that would lap through the city for weeks to come. Jonathan's hand settled lightly at her waist. His glove was warm from body heat. She placed her palm in his, and they began to turn, slowly at first, then in the full sweep of the waltz, her skirts brushing the hem of his coat, the room spinning in golden circles. "Why me?" she asked, not daring to look up. "You were the only woman in this room not trying to be chosen," he said simply. Her heart stuttered. They moved in silence for a beat, then another. She felt every breath he took, every inch of distance between them, precisely measured, maddeningly respectful. He did not draw her close. He did not smile, and yet the tension between them was a drawn bowstring, humming. She knew this would not end well. It could not. The eldest daughter is not chosen in front of everyone. The overlooked are not elevated in public. There are rules in Pittsburgh, rules gilded in coal dust and generational pride, and he had just shattered one of them beneath the soles of his perfectly polished shoes. When the waltz ended, he bowed over her hand. The music faded. No one clapped. "Thank you," he said, eyes steady. Lila curtsied, her voice caught somewhere in her throat. He turned and walked away, and the ballroom, after a beat too long, began to breathe again. Behind her, Clara's footsteps retreated in silence, and Lila Davenport, who had come merely to chaperone, stood alone on the floor, pearl pendant trembling faintly against her collarbone as the first rumors bloomed like roses from mouths too polite to speak plainly. She had not asked for this. She had not prepared for this. But now she would have to answer the question all of Pittsburgh was already asking. Why her? And more importantly, what would she do now that someone had finally seen her? The morning after the winter assembly arrived, veiled in silence, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Outside the Davenport home, the snowfall had deepened overnight, blanketing the narrow street in ivory stillness, smoothing over the grime and cinder that usually clung to the stones like shame. But beneath that hush, something electric pulsed. Lila stood at the parlour window, her fingertips resting on the cold glass, eyes fixed on the still world beyond. The snowfall blurred the boundaries between roofs and sky, between present and memory. She wore a plain wool house dress in stormy grey, buttoned to her throat with a lace collar yellowed slightly with age. Her hair had been pulled into its usual low knot, but stray wisps had loosened near her ears. She had not spoken much since the ball. Not to Clara, not even to her mother. She did not know what to make of what had happened. She had replayed it endlessly, his hand extended, the feel of his glove against her waist, the silence that followed their waltz. She had told herself it was nothing, a gesture, a moment of provocation or whim. But something in the way he had looked at her, steady, unblinking, had lingered. She turned from the window when she heard the sound of boots on the front step. Not Clara's light step, nor their housekeeper's practical shuffle. It was deliberate, measured. Then came the knock. Mrs. Davenport, wrapped in her shawl, looked up from her needlework in the corner of the parlour. Her face was pale as porcelain and nearly as still. "Lila," she said without emotion, "see who it is." But Lila already knew. She opened the door slowly. There he was, standing against the swirl of falling snow, tall in his black overcoat, gloved hands clasped before him. Jonathan Markham removed his hat, revealing dark hair neatly parted, only lightly dusted with snow. His eyes, that peculiar blend of hazel and green, found hers immediately. "Miss Davenport," he said with a bow that was not too deep, but undeniably respectful. "I hope I've not come at an untimely hour," Lila's voice nearly caught. "Not at all, Mr. Markham. Please, come in." He stepped inside, brushing the snow from his shoulders. The scent of winter clung to his coat, cedar, cold air, and a hint of tobacco leaf. She led him into the parlour, her heart an unsteady rhythm in her chest. Mrs. Davenport sat upright, folding her needlework carefully and placing it in her lap. Her expression was unreadable, her posture that of a matriarch who had once ruled over better drawing rooms and still remembered how. "Mr. Markham," she said with a slight tilt of her head, "you honour our home." He bowed again. "Mrs. Davenport." "Miss Clara." Clara stood near the mantel, her hands gripping the edge just slightly, her powdered cheeks flushed more from tension than cold. Her gown, rose silk trimmed with white lace, was too fine for a morning at home. But then, Clara never missed an opportunity to be prepared. Jonathan turned to Lila. "May I speak with you?" he asked. "With your family present?" Lila nodded slowly and sat, her hands clasped in her lap, bracing herself against something unnamed but approaching. He remained standing. "Last night," he began, his voice low but clear, "I made a choice that many found unexpected. I asked your daughter to dance, Mrs. Davenport, but that gesture was not one of impulse. It was a prelude to this." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small velvet box. Clara's breath hitched. Mrs. Davenport's knuckles whitened. Lila's chest constricted. "I have come to ask for Lila's hand in marriage." The silence that followed was not shocked, but strained, like crystals stretched beyond its limit. Mrs. Davenport inhaled slowly. "Marriage is not a trifling arrangement, Mr. Markham." "No," he agreed, "which is why I come with all due seriousness. My intentions are honourable, And my regard for your daughter," he paused, "is sincere." Lila looked up at him, heart pounding, unsure whether she had heard hope or hesitation in that pause. Clara stepped forward, her voice laced with sweetness that barely veiled the acid beneath. "Mr. Markham, surely such declarations are premature. You hardly know my sister." Jonathan turned toward her with the calm of a man who had heard worse from men with sharper teeth. "Miss Clara," he said evenly, "your sister is a woman of intelligence, integrity, and courage. Qualities I admire, qualities rare in any society." Clara blinked, her lips parting slightly, then closed them without reply. "Mrs. Davenport broke the silence. "And may I ask," she said softly, "whether this proposal is born of sentiment or strategy?" Jonathan met her gaze squarely. "A bit of both, madam. The boardrooms I move in are not unlike ballrooms. Performances are watched, alliances scrutinized. My choice to align myself with Miss Davenport would signal stability, intelligence, a sense of duty, and it would be honest." His eyes shifted back to Lila. "Because beyond all that, I believe her presence at my side would not only benefit my reputation, it would temper my judgment. And if I may admit, bring me peace." Lila's hands trembled faintly in her lap. "And what does Lila believe?" Mrs. Davenport asked quietly. Lila looked at her mother, then at Clara, whose expression now resembled glass. Too perfect, too sharp. She turned to Jonathan. "I am honored," she said, the words emerging with care, "and I do not take such an offer lightly. But I would ask, time." He nodded once. "Of course." His acceptance came without disappointment, which in itself felt strange. "I shall return when you are ready." He inclined his head, bowed once more to the women of the room, and stepped out into the snow, leaving behind a silence that echoed louder than his words. Clara exhaled sharply and stormed from the room, the hem of her gown trailing fury. "Mrs. Davenport said nothing, but when she reached for her needlework, her hands were not quite steady. That evening the snow deepened. The city, blanketed in white, glowed faintly beneath the street lamps. Chimneys exhaled their ceaseless plumes. The hush returned, but within it, Clara moved like a shadow. She had waited until Lila had gone upstairs. The parlour was empty. She donned her cloak without aid, wrapped herself in fur-trimmed silk, and tucked a parcel under her arm. Outside, her boots crushed the untouched snow with purpose. The carriage awaited at the corner, its lantern flickered. Inside, the figure of Mr. Holland sat, his silhouette framed by smoke from the cigar in his gloved fingers. She climbed in without hesitation. "You have something for me?" he asked, voice rough from age and arrogance. Clara handed him the parcel. "My father's ledgers, some of his old accounts, and a full list of our remaining debts." Holland's grin was slow, reptilian. "You offer me the noose around your family's neck. I offer you leverage," Clara said, "and I want something in return." He cocked his head. "And what is it you want, Miss Davenport?" She did not blink. "A future." The carriage wheels turned through the snow as Pittsburgh slept, unaware that the eldest daughter had been proposed to, and the youngest had just sold more than her name. Inside the Davenport house, Lila lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Snow tapped against the window. Her hands still felt the weight of the unopened ring box. She did not know what kind of man proposed with such poise and then left with such silence. And she did not yet know that beneath that stillness something had begun to move, something vast, irrevocable, and dangerously alive. The ring had been placed on her finger not with fanfare, but with quiet gravity. There had been no parade of roses, no whispered sonnet behind drawn curtains. Only the steady certainty in Jonathan Markham's voice and the cool weight of gold where her gloves now strained. The city had not yet erupted in opinion, but Lila could feel the pause, the held breath of every eye that would soon turn to her. A banker's fiancée, the elder daughter, the overlooked no longer. A week had passed since the proposal. Snow had melted into slush, staining the edges of crinolines and leaving grey streaks along the cobblestones. The air in Pittsburgh, always tinged with coal and smoke, now carried the faint scent of thawing regret and the iron promise of spring. But inside the Davenport household, the climate remained unchanged. Polite, chilly, fragile. Clara had not spoken to her sister since the evening Lila accepted. She floated through the house like a silken ghost, all soft sighs and rustling skirts, her smiles too bright, too still. Mrs. Davenport remained dignified, though her questions had grown pointed, her glances lingering longer on the newspaper columns that now occasionally mentioned Lila's name. Lila, meanwhile, had found herself standing at the edge of a world she had never imagined entering, a world of drawing rooms with gilded ceilings, of carriages that did not creak, of women who wore fox fur at midday and spoke of illness as though it were fashion. She moved through it with careful steps. Her own wardrobe altered and let out to match expectations. Her mother's old woolen walking suit had been freshly hemmed, a new velvet ribbon stitched into the collar to suggest distinction without ostentation. It was in such a suit that she arrived at St. Agnes Parish Hall for the ladies' charity tea, escorted by a driver Jonathan had sent with the simplest of notes. "Your presence would be most welcome. J.M." She stepped into the room beneath a crystal chandelier, its pendants glittering like icicles in the gaslight. The scent of cinnamon and clove mingled with the perfume of expensive soap and the crisp starch of French lace. Women stood in small circles, their voices musical, punctuated by soft laughter and the occasional clink of china against porcelain saucer. They turned when Lila entered, not as wolves would turn toward prey, but as falcons might glance at a bird that had inexplicably flown too high. "Miss Davenport," cooed Mrs. Felicity Braithwaite, a woman with diamond teardrops hanging from her ears and an accent as sharp as her corset boning. "We are so delighted you could join us." Lila curtsied gently, her fingers smoothing the skirt that would never be cut from Paris silk. "Thank you for the invitation." "You must tell us," another woman added, "how it feels to be engaged to Pittsburgh's most sought-after banker." Lila smiled politely. "Unexpected." A ripple of laughter followed, some genuine, some laced with venom. She was guided toward the tea table, where delicate cups painted with violets were arranged beside sugar cubes tonged from a silver bowl. She accepted a cup, nodded at the flurry of compliments regarding her brooch, and seated herself near the window, where she could see the grey-streaked sky beyond the chapel rooftops. The conversation floated like smoke. "Of course it's admirable work, tending to the poor," one woman said, as she delicately spread raspberry preserves on her biscuit. "But sometimes I wonder, do they truly want help, or do they simply want attention?" Another sniffed. "I heard one of the mothers at the foundry asked for a second blanket this winter, 2, as though charity were her right." "Perhaps if their husbands didn't drink so much," murmured another, "they wouldn't need handouts." Lila felt the warmth drain from her fingertips. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing snowflakes against the arched window pane. Across the street she saw a small figure, no more than 10, stumble on the chapel steps. His coat was thin, sleeves too short, and his cap had slipped from his head. She frowned, setting down her untouched tea. "I beg your pardon," she murmured. She crossed the room swiftly, unnoticed or ignored, and slipped into the chill of the street. The wind caught her veil, whipping it lightly against her cheek. The boy lay curled on the stone steps, his lips pale, eyes glassy. She knelt beside him. "Sweetheart," she whispered, brushing the snow from his hair. "Can you hear me?" He blinked. His face was sharp with hunger, his hands red with cold. "Come," she said, wrapping her shawl around him. "You'll be warm soon." Inside the parish, she found a small side room, likely meant for Sunday school, and laid him on a padded bench near the hearth. A faded patchwork quilt lay folded nearby, forgotten or left with hope. She covered him and stoked the coals into reluctant life. The boy's eyes fluttered open. "You're safe," she told him. "Just rest." He nodded, too weak to speak. She found a storybook on the shelf, a worn volume of Grimm's Tales, and opened it. Her voice was quiet, measured. The words spilled into the room like balm, weaving through the cracks in the plaster and the ache in her chest. She did not notice the figure in the doorway until the tale was nearly done. Jonathan stood leaning against the frame, his hat in hand, his coat still dusted with snow. He did not interrupt. He simply watched. When she looked up and met his gaze, her breath stilled. He stepped inside, kneeling beside the boy, his gloved hand reaching to brush the child's forehead with surprising gentleness. "I've arranged for a nurse," he said quietly. "She'll take him to the infirmary at the mill." Lila nodded. "He wouldn't have survived the afternoon," she murmured. Jonathan's jaw flexed. "Most don't." Their eyes held, the silence deep and unspoken. She saw something shift in him, something not polished or deliberate, but real. A crack in the marble, a flicker of what he might have been before the world made him iron. "Thank you," he said, and this time the words were not formal. She rose, smoothing her skirts, and walked with him back toward the hallway. As they reached the vestibule, he paused. "I saw you today," he said, "in that room, listening. And? I wondered how long you could stay quiet before standing." She lowered her gaze. "Not long, it seems." His voice dropped, barely audible. "Good. Then, without another word, he held the door for her and stepped into the cold. Later that evening, as twilight bruised the sky, Clara entered the foyer of a grand house lit with gas sconces and warmed by the scent of brandy and varnish. She wore her finest gown, pale lilac with jet buttons. Mr. Holland greeted her with a bow too deep to be genuine. "My son awaits," he said with a smirk. "He's quite eager to meet you." Clara smiled, all lashes and practiced light. Outside, the city darkened, but the coals still burned, and in a quiet chamber near the parish hearth, a boy dreamed for the first time in weeks. The hearth in Jonathan Markham's office crackled softly, the flames rising and falling like the breath of something half asleep and waiting. Beyond the frosted windows, the steel skeleton of Pittsburgh exhaled smoke into the brittle afternoon sky. Inside, the air held the scent of ink, leather bindings, and quiet war. Jonathan stood at his desk, gloved hands resting on a stack of correspondence. The firelight caught the sharp edges of his profile, the straight nose, the high cheekbones, the firm set of his jaw. His waistcoat, navy with a discreet herringbone weave, fit him with impeccable precision, as if it had been tailored to contain more than fabric: control, calculation, and restraint. A knock interrupted the silence. He did not call for entry, but the door opened nonetheless. Gideon Holland entered without ceremony, a storm wrapped in wool and arrogance. He was broader than Jonathan, thicker through the chest and neck, with heavy sideburns and a sneer that clung to his mouth like a scar. His overcoat, trimmed with raccoon fur, gave off the faint odor of cigar smoke and old money. In his gloved hand, he carried a cane he didn't need, but liked to wield. "Markham," he said without greeting, crossing the room and lowering himself into the chair opposite the desk. He did not wait to be offered. Jonathan did not sit. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Mr. Holland?" Holland leaned back, the leather of the chair groaning. "Pleasure, no. Business, urgency, and disappointment, I suppose." Jonathan said nothing. "I've seen the papers," Holland continued, removing his gloves finger by finger. "The engagement, the speeches. You've stirred quite the conversation, and not all of it favourable." Jonathan raised a brow. "Society always talks." "Eventually it finds something else." "Does it?" Holland tilted his head. "You've aligned yourself with a woman who reads to beggars and brings vagrants into the church. That may win you a hymn or two, but not the confidence of your investors." Jonathan's jaw twitched. "Lila Davenport is a woman of integrity, which is more than can be said for the circles we usually entertain." "That's precisely the problem," Holland said, now resting his gloved hand flat on the cane. "She's too clean." "Too moral, too observant. The wrong kind of woman to stand beside a man like you in rooms where decisions are made with hands already dirty." Jonathan stepped around the desk. His voice dropped to a warning hum. "Be careful." Holland grinned. "You know, I've always liked you, Jonathan. You're clever. You built your bank without asking permission, and you're not afraid to sharpen your elbows when needed. That's why this—" He gestured vaguely toward the fire. "Is so damned sad." Jonathan narrowed his gaze. "Say what you came to say." "Withdraw the engagement," Holland said plainly. "Make a polite excuse. Illness, a difference of temperament. Society will forgive. Rejoin the syndicate. Take your rightful place at the table, and we'll forget this detour." "And if I don't?" Holland rose, slow and deliberate. Then you'll watch your alliances evaporate, your protection thin. The whisper of instability is enough to make depositors nervous, and nervous men are expensive to calm. You know that as well as I. Jonathan's eyes locked onto his. Is that a threat? Holland's smile never faltered. It's an opportunity. He turned, pausing at the door. Oh, and tell Miss Davenport her sister sends her warmest regards. Clara's turned out to be quite the conversationalist, and her loyalty is, negotiable. He left without another word, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed louder than his footsteps. Jonathan stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the fire. Then he sat and removed his gloves, finger by finger, until only his bare hands remained, hands that had signed too many contracts, shaken too many devils. Later that evening, Lila sat in the Davenport parlour, her embroidery idle in her lap. The gaslight cast gentle shadows on the wallpaper, and the ticking of the mantel clock marked time with patient indifference. Clara entered with her usual flourish, cheeks flushed from the cold, curls arranged into perfect rebellion. "You're late," Lila said without looking up. "Dinner was dull," Clara replied. Edward suggested an impromptu visit to the piano hall. Who was I to refuse? Lila set her needle aside. Edward Holland? Clara smiled. Is that so difficult to believe? No, Lila said softly, just unexpected. Clara sat with the poise of a woman born for attention. You might as well get used to it. Things change. Lila studied her sister's expression, too bright, too crisp, like a painting left in the snow, starting to crack beneath the surface. After Clara left the room, Lila gathered the pile of letters recently delivered. Bills, invitations, and, tucked between them, a pale envelope with an unfamiliar seal. She opened it with care. Inside was a short note. Miss Davenport, my father believes in leveraging all resources, including family. I thought you should know. E.H. Beneath the note, a copy of correspondence, dates, figures, a mention of ledgers only someone within the household could have accessed. Her stomach tightened. She climbed the stairs slowly, heart pounding in her chest, and entered her room. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment before crossing to her writing desk. The letter trembled in her hand. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply sat, staring at the ink on the page, understanding that ambition could turn blood to water faster than betrayal could be named. The next morning, she met Jonathan at the edge of the park. They walked in silence, the snow beneath their boots crunching softly, the sun barely warm enough to touch their skin. I received a letter, she said finally. I know, he replied. She looked up. You knew? He nodded once, hands clasped behind his back. Holland was proud to mention it. And you didn't tell me? He stopped walking. Would you have wanted to hear it from me? That your sister... She's still my sister, Lila whispered, though the words tasted like ash. Jonathan's gaze softened. That's why I said nothing. I didn't want to force you to choose. She stared at the pond beyond the trees, its surface frozen and glistening beneath the pale sky. "Thank you," she said at last, "for protecting her, even when she wouldn't protect me." He turned to her fully, voice low, steady. "I didn't do it for her, Lila. I did it for you." The wind carried the scent of smoke from far-off chimneys, and in that moment something shifted between them, no longer silence, but shared pain. Clara, meanwhile, sat in the Holland drawing-room, sipping sweet cordial from a crystal glass, her eyes fixed on the man across from her. Edward Holland smiled politely, but his interest was clinical, transactional. "You'll do well," Gideon Holland said from the fireside, voice like gravel, "if you stay clever, if you stay obedient." Clara smiled, lifting her glass. "I've waited too long to be ignored." The room smelled of ambition and expensive varnish. And in the city below, the smoke rose as always, concealing the boundaries between power and sacrifice, between truth and the kind of silence that could cost more than a name. Before the sun rose over Pittsburgh that day, the world broke. It happened in the grey hour, that quiet space between night and morning when only the factories breathed. Along the Allegheny's edge, where soot clung to brick and icicles hung from rusting gutters, a single mill flared bright, an unnatural bloom of fire against the fading stars. The sound followed a heartbeat later, deep and violent, a growl from the belly of the earth. People woke to windows rattling in their panes, to dishes trembling on shelves, to birds shrieking from winter-black trees. Those closest to the site would later say the air itself had cracked, that the heavens had roared as if in mourning. But when the silence returned, it was worse. Lila stood at her window in her nightgown, heart hammering, her breath fogging the glass. A trail of smoke rose in the east, thick and dark, streaking the pale morning sky like ink spilled across a letter. Within the hour, church bells rang, first one, then several. A call not to worship, but to gather, to serve, to mourn. By mid-morning, St. Agnes's parish hall had been transformed into a makeshift infirmary. The long tables, once used for hymnals and bake sales, now held bloodied cloth, cracked bowls of water, and the broken bodies of men. The smell was unbearable. Coal dust, charred fabric, and something metallic that clung to the tongue. Lila moved among them in silence. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair hastily pinned. She pressed cloth to burns, cradled heads onto makeshift pillows, and spoke in a voice low enough to quiet fear. The rector's wife wept openly, her hands shaking as she poured water into chipped pitchers. Outside, more wagons arrived, some with groaning men, others with bodies already still. At the back of the hall, beneath the last window not yet fogged with breath, Lila found a boy no older than 17. His coat was half burned away, and one arm bent unnaturally at the elbow. He whispered for his mother. Lila took his uninjured hand and held it as the rector murmured a prayer, his voice thin with sorrow. Time passed without meaning. It was just past noon when the whisper reached her. 2 women from the committee had arrived, perfumed, composed, their hands gloved despite the heat of the hall. They stood near the doorway, speaking in the low, fast rhythm of those accustomed to secrets. Lila only caught fragments. And do safety inspection. Postponed again. Last quarter's delay. Signatures from his bank. Her blood turned cold. She stepped closer, masking the movement by folding a fresh blanket over one of the cots. I saw the ledger myself, one of them muttered, underwritten without a single oversight visit. I told you, the other replied. He may be clever, but he's careless, or worse, complicit. They turned to leave, their voices trailing behind like perfume in the air. Lila stood frozen, the blanket slipping from her arms. Her thoughts felt slow and disjointed, like wheels caught in ice. Jonathan's bank, the ledger, the signature. She did not ask for her coat. She did not explain her departure. She simply walked out into the cold, her skirts brushing against snowdrifts, her boots sinking into slush, and made her way to him. He was not in his office. The staff, shaken and subdued, directed her to his home. By the time she reached the townhouse, her hands were trembling. The butler opened the door at once, recognizing her. Miss Davenport, I need to see him. He hesitated, then nodded. He's in the study. She found Jonathan seated in a high-backed chair, his cravat loosened, his waistcoat unbuttoned. He looked older than he had that morning, his hair slightly disheveled, his posture weary. A single glass of untouched brandy sat on the table beside him. Lila, he said, rising. She did not speak at first. Her eyes searched his face, looking for cracks, for truth, for the man she had allowed herself to believe in. I was at St. Agnes, she said. I heard what they said. He stiffened. What exactly? That the mill hadn't been inspected in months, that the bank approved it anyway. He closed his eyes briefly. That particular account wasn't handled by me. But the signature at the bottom, yes, it's mine. I signed off without reviewing the ledger myself. I trusted the internal audit. She stepped forward. Dozens of men are lying on cots, Jonathan. Some of them won't walk again. Some won't live to see the night. I know. Do you? His hands curled into fists at his sides. Do you think I meant for this to happen? I don't know what to think, she whispered, and that truth struck deeper than any accusation. He turned from her, walking to the mantel where a small lacquered box rested. He opened it slowly, removed a tarnished object, and held it out in his palm. It was a medal, its ribbons scorched and frayed, the metal warped by heat. This belonged to my brother, he said, voice rough. David. He was 20 when the boiler ruptured in the Markham Hale foundry. I was 17. Lila's breath caught. He died before the flames even reached him. The blast shattered his spine. My mother kept this, he said, his gaze distant. She made me promise I'd never forget. That I'd build something better, safer, cleaner. She looked at the medal, then at him. Then how did this happen? He shook his head. Because I got tired. Because I let myself believe the delegation was enough. Because I buried David's name under ledgers and board votes and quarterly reports. Silence stretched between them, heavy and alive. Lila stepped closer. You can still keep that promise. He met her gaze. There was no mask in his eyes, only sorrow and something rawer, shame perhaps. or need. I want to, he said, but I may lose everything in doing so. Then lose it, she whispered, but not yourself. The fire crackled softly as though agreeing. He reached for her hand, but stopped just short, fingers suspended in the space between them. I didn't ask for you to carry this with me, he said quietly. I chose to. Their hands did not touch, but the distance was no longer empty. Elsewhere, beneath silk-draped lanterns and winter roses frozen in crystal vases, Clara stood at the Holland garden party, her laughter delicate, her hand resting lightly on Edward's sleeve. She spoke of poetry she had never read and smiled at compliments she did not believe. She danced and curtsied and played the role perfectly. But when the news of the explosion reached the gathering, when murmurs of ash and death passed between champagne flutes and fan folds, Clara excused herself to the farthest edge of the terrace. She looked out over the city where the smoke still hung low, and for a moment, just a moment, her mask slipped, and in the hush that followed dusk, the wind carried the scent of charred metal and the quiet ache of choices still to come. The days after the explosion were marked by a kind of silence not even winter could replicate. It hung in the corners of parlours and crept through the alleyways behind the mills. Church bells no longer tolled. They had grown weary. The air was heavy with soot and unanswered questions. Inside the Davenport home, time slowed. The scent of coal smoke slipped through the window frames no matter how tightly Lila sealed them, clinging to curtains and linens like an unwanted ghost. She spent her mornings tending to her mother, whose health had begun to falter under the weight of worry and age. The old woman's once keen eyes had grown clouded with fatigue, her voice thinned to whispers, and her steps slowed to the rhythm of decline. On a grey afternoon thick with sleet, Lila entered the upstairs study, a room rarely disturbed since her father's passing. It remained untouched, frozen in dust and shadows, just as he had left it 3 years before. The heavy oak desk bore the neat disorder of a man who had once been meticulous, a set of pens arranged in a narrow brass holder, a paperweight in the shape of a ship's wheel, and a half-finished letter folded beneath an inkwell now dry. She had come only to search for a woolen blanket, believing one had been stored in the chest at the foot of the bookcase. But when she lifted the lid, her fingers brushed not wool, but leather. Ledgers. 5 of them. Bound in navy and emerald covers, edges frayed, each bearing her father's initials embossed in gold. She carried them to the desk, heart steady, but breath caught. Page by page, the quiet world she thought she had known began to unravel. Payments from the Holland syndicate, some coded, others not. Property transfers. A land parcel titled in her father's name, then sold at half its value to a holding company managed by Gideon Holland. A letter, unsigned, written in her father's precise hand, expressing regret for dealings that had once seemed necessary. Mentions of safety waivers, of ledger entries adjusted to meet deadlines, of bribes disguised as bonuses. He had tried near the end to step away. That much was clear. His language grew cautious, even fearful. But the ink did not lie. He had once been part of it. Lila stared at the pages until her vision blurred, her father's handwriting blurring into condemnation. She sat back, the weight of knowledge heavier than any ledger. Downstairs, a clock struck 4. By dusk, she was at Jonathan's townhouse, the ledgers wrapped in canvas beneath her cloak. She did not wait to be announced. He met her in the front hall, the sight of her bringing a flicker of hope to his tired eyes, hope that vanished the moment he saw her expression. She spoke first. "I found them in my father's study." He understood immediately. "How bad?" he asked. She handed him the ledgers in silence. They sat in the study, firelight dancing along the spines of the books between them. Jonathan turned each page slowly, his face impassive, but the muscle in his jaw pulsed. When he reached the final page, he closed the book with a soft thud. "If this is made public," he said at last, "it could unravel more than just Holland." She waited. "It would expose banking practices we've all taken for granted," he continued. "My name is on at least 3 of these properties as intermediary. I could be implicated. My board will want to silence this." Lila looked at him with quiet disbelief. "Are you asking me to bury this?" "I'm asking you to understand the cost." She stood, her hands clenched. "Dozens of men are dead, others maimed, and you're speaking of cost?" His voice rose, rare and sharp. "Because that's the language they use, Lila. That's the language I've been forced to speak since I first sat at their table. Everything is weighed against what it will cost to tell the truth. Then it's time someone paid it." Their eyes met, his darkened with conflict, hers lit with fury. "I am not your adversary," he said, softer now. "No," she whispered, "but I'm no longer sure you're the man I believed you were." He stepped forward, his voice shaking with something closer to pain. "And what am I, then?" She could not answer. Or would not. Instead, she turned and left. Snow had begun to fall again, quiet and cold, turning the world pale and silent as she stepped into the carriage. That night she sat beside her mother's bed, wiping the older woman's forehead with a damp cloth. The fire crackled low. Mrs. Davenport's breathing had grown shallow, her eyes fluttering beneath pale lids. "Mother," Lila whispered, brushing a lock of silver hair from her temple, "I found something about Father." "Things I didn't want to know." The older woman stirred, her lips parting. "He thought he could manage it," she murmured, the words barely audible. "He thought he could stay clean, long enough to leave it behind." Lila swallowed hard. "Why didn't you say anything?" Mrs. Davenport's hand found her daughter's. "Because grief rewrites memory. I wanted to remember him as he tried to be." A tear traced down Lila's cheek. "I'm afraid I've become a stranger to the man I love." Her mother's lips curved faintly, weak and fleeting. "Love," she whispered, "does not grow in peace, child. It grows in the rubble." Her eyes fluttered shut. A crash echoed from the hallway, a dropped tray, a cry from the maid, and Lila rose in alarm. Clara entered moments later, her cheeks flushed, her voice sharp. "What happened?" "She fainted," Lila said, trembling. "She's resting now." Clara's eyes fell on the discarded towel, the half-drunk cup of tea, the trembling in Lila's hands. You weren't watching her closely enough, she accused. You were off playing martyr again. Lila turned slowly. I've been here all day. And what does that earn you? Clara hissed. A halo. This is not the time. It's never the time, is it? Clara snapped. Not when you're always the one holding the world together, just enough to shame the rest of us. Lila stared at her sister, seeing through the powder and ribbons to the bitterness beneath. But before she could reply, a rasping voice cut through the air. Lila! They both turned. Mrs. Davenport's eyes were open, her hand reaching. Lila! Not Clara. Not anyone else. Only her. Clara's mouth closed. Her hands dropped to her sides. She backed out of the room without another word. Lila took her mother's hand and sat by her again, her other hand clutching the truth buried in her father's ledgers and the echo of Jonathan's silence. The fire burned low. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance a bell rang, not to mark time but to announce that the old order was shifting, quietly, irreversibly. The wind that swept through Pittsburgh that morning was sharp and unrepentant, biting at cravats and rustling the hems of woolen coats. The sky above the city was the color of old pewter, its light dull and metallic, mirroring the mood that gripped the hearts of those behind the tall windows of the Markham and Company building. Inside, gaslight flickered over polished mahogany panels, casting long shadows over men whose names determined the fates of thousands. Jonathan Markham stood before the boardroom window, one hand resting on the brass edge of the sill, the other curled at his side. He had not removed his overcoat. The chill in the room had nothing to do with weather. Behind him, 12 men sat in high-backed leather chairs, their expressions ranging from calculated neutrality to veiled contempt. On the center of the table lay a thick envelope, opened, its contents laid bare. Jonathan knew the document's weight before he had even touched it. A dossier assembled with care. Property transactions, financial ties between the late Mr. Davenport and Holland Syndicate, evidence of misused credit lines, some dated, others recent enough to sting. Holland had not merely fired a warning shot, he had drawn a sword. I trust, said Milton Graves, chairman of the board, and a man whose voice was equal parts rust and gravel. You've read what was submitted. Jonathan turned slowly. His face was composed, but the pulse at his throat beat like a war drum. I have. It puts us in a delicate position, said another man, narrowing his eyes. Your affiliation with Miss Davenport now appears compromised. There was a pause, and then, deliberate and poisonous, came the voice of Gideon Holland. Not just compromised, he said from the corner, where he stood with theatrical restraint. It's untenable. He walked forward, slow as a funeral procession, and placed a second sheet atop the dossier. An affidavit, he explained. Signed by Edward, my son, confirming Miss Clara Davenport's forthcoming engagement. A few heads lifted, others stiffened. Miss Davenport's loyalty, he continued, has proven far more pragmatic. Jonathan's fists clenched behind his back. She provided these records? He asked. Holland smiled. Let's just say she understands the cost of silence. The room darkened, not from lack of light, but from the shadow that truth casts when trust is broken. Graves cleared his throat. Jonathan, The board urges you officially and unanimously to make a public separation, a statement that your engagement to Miss Lila Davenport has been dissolved. Quietly, of course, respectfully. And if I refuse? A silence. Graves gave a measured sigh. Then your position here becomes unsustainable. Depositors will panic. Our associates across Philadelphia and Boston will distance themselves. You know the consequences. Jonathan nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. He glanced down at the dossier. The ink danced before his eyes, not because of uncertainty, but because of fury, of heartbreak, of the slow realization that the noose around Lila's family had been pulled tighter by her own blood. He was opening his mouth to speak, perhaps to yield, perhaps to fight, when the double doors at the end of the room creaked open. And she entered. Lila Davenport stepped into the boardroom without escort, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. She wore a dark wool gown with a velvet collar, gloves the color of winter stone, and her mother's brooch pinned at her throat. The fabric whispered with every step, not a rustle, but a hush, commanding attention without asking for it. Every man in the room turned. Jonathan's breath caught, but he did not speak. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, clear, "I ask your permission to address this room." Holland scoffed, but Graves gestured with one hand. "You have it." Lila stepped to the center of the room, between Jonathan and the board. "You have read documents," she began, "that link my late father to dealings with Mr. Holland's enterprise. I do not deny their authenticity. I discovered them myself. I placed them in Mr. Markham's hands. A few brows lifted. "And you brought them here?" asked a skeptical voice. "No," she said, "he did not." There was a beat of silence. "My sister," Lila continued, "elected to do so in my place, though I gave her no such permission. She acted of her own accord, and for reasons best understood by the man who has groomed her for his son's ambition." Holland's eyes narrowed. "I am not here to defend my father's choices," Lila said, her voice rising just slightly. "Nor to protect the illusions of legacy. What I'm here to say is this: Mr. Markham is not my shield. I do not hide behind his title, nor his influence. He did not ask me to suppress these truths, nor did he manipulate them to his advantage." She turned to face him then. Their eyes met. The storm inside his gaze met the fire within hers, and stilled. "He protected my family's dignity when it would have been easier to bury us. He protected my name even when I questioned his." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his throat working with emotion too volatile to speak aloud. She faced the board again. "You may call off our engagement," she said. "You may strip him of his title, his seat, and his fortune, but you will not rewrite the truth." Her final words hung in the room like smoke, curling into the very corners. Then she stepped back. "I am finished." And she walked toward the doors. Jonathan's voice stopped her. "Lila." It was not a command. It was a confession. She paused. He stepped forward, placing his hand over hers, in public, before them all. "I will not withdraw," he said, "from this engagement, from the truth, from you." One by one, the men around the table looked away, not out of courtesy, but because they could not bear to watch what conviction looked like when it burned clean through steel and shame. Holland muttered something under his breath and exited with the swish of his heavy coat, his boots thudding down the corridor. Jonathan turned to the board. "If this is the end of my tenure," he said, "then so be it. I would rather walk away with my name intact than stay seated while silence buries the dead." Lila stood beside him, and in that still, gaslit room, surrounded by ledgers, old men, and the echoes of power undone, the two of them formed a quiet rebellion, one made not of promises, but of choices, of fire, and of the kind of love that stands not behind, but beside. The hall smelled of waxed wood and quiet judgment. It was the largest shareholders' gathering of the year, and yet no one spoke above a whisper. They had come expecting spectacle, perhaps a public apology, a discreet announcement, a shift in leadership shrouded in elegant euphemism. They did not expect what would come to pass. Not the woman in the charcoal wool gown standing at the head of the chamber, not her voice, not her stillness. Lila Davenport stood before the assembled ranks of Pittsburgh's wealthiest men, steel barons with cigar-stained fingers, bankers with polished shoes and cautious hearts, merchants who spoke in numbers more fluently than in prayers. She was not among them by title nor by blood, and yet every eye was on her, not because of beauty, though hers was the kind that deepened with stillness, not because of scandal, though it had tried to cling to her. But because there was something unflinching in the way she held herself, like a stone in the river, shaped by the current but never swept away. She spoke slowly, not softly but clearly, letting each word settle like dust upon ledgers, long undisturbed. "I was not raised to address rooms such as this," she said, her voice echoing against the high ceiling. "And I have no title that obligates you to hear me. But I stand here because silence, when we know better, is a choice." "And I choose not to be silent." Several men shifted in their seats. One coughed, another crossed his arms, but no one interrupted. "I have seen your mills," she continued. "I have walked beside men whose hands are calloused not by ambition, but by survival. I have held the fingers of boys younger than your sons, twisted by machinery too old and too fast. I have watched women dig through ash to find the coins that kept them warm through one more night. And I have read the ledgers, the ones my father kept, the ones Mr. Markham showed me, where numbers stand in place of names, and where profit is counted in broken ribs and silence bought with convenience." Her voice did not rise, but the room grew tighter. "You believe you built this city, but it was built by the backs you've turned from and the voices you've muted." A man near the rear muttered, "This is sentiment, not business." Lila turned her head. "And what is business without consequence?" Another voice cut in, low, smooth and theatrical. "She means well," said Gideon Holland, rising slowly. "But she mistakes charity for strategy. Miss Davenport is understandably emotional given her father's complicated legacy. I don't fault her, but let's not pretend outrage is a solution." Jonathan stood. The room went still. His voice was quiet, but it carried like the strike of a bell. "She does not speak with outrage. She speaks with truth." He walked forward, not to her side, but just behind her, not as protector, but as ally. "I know what's been said about her, and about me, that I've allowed emotion to cloud judgment, that I've risked the integrity of this bank for the sake of sympathy. He faced the room now. His eyes, always controlled, now gleamed with clarity. But what is integrity if it cannot withstand scrutiny, if it collapses under the weight of what we willingly ignore? Holland narrowed his eyes. "You're making a mistake." "No," Jonathan said. "I've already made it. I've allowed fear of losing status to guide decisions that should have been rooted in principle. That ends today." He placed a hand gently on the ledgers set before him. "These documents," he said, "will be submitted for independent investigation. All accounts tied to Holland-affiliated partnerships will be suspended pending audit." Our new lending guidelines will include mandatory safety inspections, third-party reviews, and public disclosure of risk thresholds. Murmurs rose. He looked to Lila. "And I resign from the syndicate, effective immediately." There was no applause, no cheers, just the echo of something weightier than celebration, conviction carved into silence. At the edge of the room, Clara stood stiffly, her gloved fingers wrapped too tightly around her fan. Her cheeks were still painted with the soft bloom of rouge, her gown a triumph of pale rose silk. She had been dressed to be noticed, but in that moment no one looked her way. Edward Holland stood at her side, but slightly behind. His posture slackened with each word his father failed to counter, with each promise Jonathan made. And when the final declaration fell, Edward shifted, cleared his throat, and turned, not toward her, away. Clara's eyes followed him as he crossed the hall, his departure as quiet as it was complete. No farewell, no explanation, only retreat. She felt the heat rise to her face, but her spine remained straight. If she was to fall, she would fall without flinching. Lila, unaware of her sister's gaze, stepped back from the center of the room. She had said all she had come to say. Jonathan remained still for a moment longer, then turned to the board. "Those of you who remain," he said, "must decide what kind of institution you want to stand for. I've made my choice." And then he followed her out. They walked in silence through the corridor, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Neither reached for the other, but something passed between them with every step, something warmer than triumph, steadier than defiance. Outside, the wind had softened, the sky stretched in bands of violet and fading gold. At the corner, a boy selling newspapers called out the latest headlines. A woman passed with a bundle of laundry strapped to her back. A pair of factory men shared a cigarette, their faces drawn with fatigue. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had begun to shift. Lila stopped beneath the awning of a closed hat shop and turned to Jonathan. "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her. "Yes, I did." She searched his face and found not pride, but peace. "You'll lose their favor." He nodded. "I'd rather lose that than lose myself." "And me?" He reached for her hand. This time he did not stop short. "I never wanted to win a battle only to find you gone." Their fingers intertwined, quietly, completely. Across the street, Clara stood alone in the shadow of the building, her fan forgotten, her gloves damp with frost. She watched them, unseen, a silent spectator to the closing of a chapter that had once been hers. And in the sky above Pittsburgh, the first star blinked into view, small, constant, untouched by the fires below. The morning of the wedding broke without ceremony. No trumpets, no bustling carriages, no stream of guests wrapped in velvet and fur. Only the toll of the church bell drifting through the grey winter air, solemn and gentle, announcing something the city barely noticed. The streets glistened faintly beneath a thin layer of snow, and the smoke rising from the chimneys curled softly into the sky, as if even the industrial heart of Pittsburgh had chosen to breathe slower for a moment. Lila stood by the parlour window of her childhood home, her gloved fingers resting on the cool glass. Outside, the world looked muted, its sharp edges softened by frost. She could see the narrow spire of St. Agnes Parish through the bare branches of the elm trees. That was where she would walk in less than an hour, not as the overlooked sister, not as the banker's fiancée, but as a woman who had chosen, deliberately and without illusion, the path before her. The gown she wore was her mother's, reworked in careful stitches over long nights. The silk had faded from ivory to the colour of candlelight, and the lace at the collar had been mended twice by her own hands. A thin ribbon of pale blue threaded the waist, subtle and sincere. There was no bustle. No train sweeping behind her, only simplicity, dignified, human, quietly beautiful. Mrs. Davenport sat nearby, propped against pillows, a shawl wrapped around her frail shoulders. Her eyes followed her eldest daughter, and though her face was drawn by age and illness, a trace of warmth softened her features. "You remind me of the morning I wore it," she murmured, her voice raspy but tender. "Only, I was trembling." Lila turned and smiled faintly. "I am trembling too, Mother, just differently." Her mother's lips curved in the hint of a smile. "He's a good man, Lila." "Yes," Lila said quietly, "but not an easy one." Mrs. Davenport's hand reached for hers, cold but firm. "The good never are." A soft knock interrupted them. Mrs. Rowley, one of the parish women, appeared in the doorway, her coat speckled with snow. "It's time, dear," she said kindly. "We've lit the candles. The rector is waiting." Lila turned once more to the mirror, where the reflection staring back at her seemed unfamiliar. A woman stripped of vanity and pretense, standing on the threshold of something that was not quite joy, but something steadier. The carriage waiting outside was modest, borrowed from the church itself. As it rattled along the cobblestones, she looked out the window at the city that had shaped them both. Its steel-grey rooftops, the narrow lanes where children darted between wagons, the ever-present haze of coal smoke that painted every surface with its ghostly fingerprints. The church stood on a small hill overlooking the river, its stone walls darkened by weather and time. Inside, a handful of candles flickered against the cold. The pews were mostly empty, save for the mill workers' families who had come despite the distance and the hour. Women in patched shawls, their faces lined by labor and resilience, sat quietly beside their children. Each had brought something small, A sprig of holly, a handful of wildflowers, a ribbon faded from use. Together, they had made the church feel full. Jonathan waited near the altar. He wore a simple black coat, pressed and neat, but without ornament. No pocket watch gleamed from his vest, no gold pin brightened his lapel. He had come as himself, unadorned and unguarded. When she entered, his gaze lifted to meet hers. For a moment all sound fell away, the murmurs, the creak of benches, the rustle of fabric. He saw her, not as the woman who had stood against him in argument or challenged him in truth, but as the soul that had held him to a higher standard when the rest of the world would have let him sink quietly into comfort. She walked down the aisle slowly, each step measured. She did not float as brides are said to. She moved with weight, with intention. When she reached him, he extended his hand, not trembling, but steady, and she took it. The contact was slight, almost chaste, but it held the force of two lives converging. The rector, a man of soft voice and kind eyes, began the ceremony. The words were familiar, about duty, about fidelity, about bearing one another's burdens, but they felt different in this small, cold church, filled with flickering light and the faint scent of lilies that had been gathered from the rectory garden. Jonathan's vows came first. He did not look at the rector, but at her. "I have lived among men who measure their worth in coin and control," he said, his voice low and even. "But I have found more strength in your honesty than in all their ambition combined. I promise you this, not perfection, not ease, but truth, and the courage to meet it side by side." Lila's throat tightened, and for a moment she could not breathe. Then it was her turn. "I do not promise to be silent," she said, her words trembling but sure, "nor to walk behind you, but I will walk with you. I will speak when conscience calls, and I will listen when silence teaches more than words. I have seen the world at its cruelest, and yet I believe in its capacity to change. Together, perhaps we can hold a light long enough for others to see by." The rector's voice was soft but firm when he joined their hands and blessed the vows. There was no music, no applause, only the quiet sound of breath, the shuffle of feet, and the murmured prayers of those who had witnessed too much hardship to take joy for granted. When the ceremony ended, Mrs. Rowley stepped forward with a small bouquet of winter blossoms wrapped in paper. "For the bride," she said, "we couldn't afford much, but they're from all of us." Lila accepted them with tears she didn't expect. Jonathan bowed slightly to the women who had gathered, his expression filled with something like reverence. "Thank you," he said, "for being here." One of the mill workers, a man missing 2 fingers, called from the back, "We wouldn't have missed it, sir." "You kept the wages fair, and she kept our hearts steady." A ripple of laughter broke the tension, humble and sincere. Outside, the snow had thickened into gentle flakes, catching in Lila's dark hair as she and Jonathan stepped onto the steps. The city stretched below them, muted and grey, its rooftops glowing faintly beneath the pale winter sun. Mrs. Davenport waited in the carriage, a shawl around her shoulders. Her colour was still poor, but her eyes were brighter than Lila had seen them in months. When she saw her daughter and son-in-law emerge, she smiled, softly, shakily, but with a peace that needed no words. Jonathan helped Lila into the carriage, his hand lingering for an instant at her waist. The gesture was small, invisible to others, yet filled with intimacy, the quiet acknowledgement of all they had endured to reach this moment. As the carriage rolled away from the church, the sound of the wheels over snow filled the silence between them. Lila rested her gloved hand atop his. Neither spoke. The vows they had exchanged hung between them, fragile and new, like frost just beginning to settle. When they reached the modest townhouse that would now be theirs, Jonathan stepped out first and turned to help her down. The front windows glowed faintly with lamplight, warm, domestic, promising. She paused on the threshold, glancing back toward the city. From where she stood, she could see the faint trail of smoke rising from the mills beyond the river. The same smoke that had once divided them, now seeming almost gentle against the sky. He watched her, silent, uncertain of what she was thinking. "It's strange," she said finally, "to begin something in the shadow of so much loss." He nodded. Strange, yes, but not wrong. Inside, the parlour was small but comforting. Mrs. Rowley had left a loaf of bread and a pot of tea on the table, their steam rising into the still air. A few flowers, those same humble blossoms from the church, rested in a chipped porcelain vase. Lila touched them lightly. Jonathan removed his gloves and stood near the window, looking out. "I suppose the city will call it a poor man's wedding," he said after a moment. She smiled faintly. "Then let them. I've never needed their blessing." He turned toward her then, and something softened in his face. "No," he said quietly. "You never have." They stood facing each other in the flickering lamplight, not speaking, only breathing the same quiet air. The moment was neither grand nor triumphant. It was simply true, a beginning forged not in splendor, but in endurance. Outside, snow kept falling over Pittsburgh, covering the soot-stained streets in a fragile whiteness. And for the first time in months, Lila Davenport felt not victorious, but at peace. She had chosen not the safest path, nor the easiest, but the one that was honest. When Jonathan reached for her hand again, she let him hold it, not as possession, as partnership. They stood together at the window, watching the city lights blur beneath the snow. There was no music, no celebration, only the steady rhythm of their hearts, and the knowledge that love, in its truest form, had no need to shine to be seen. The snow lingered well into February, blanketing the steep hills of Pittsburgh in a hush that made the clang of hammers and hiss of steam feel strangely distant, almost respectful. The mills still roared, flames still bloomed in their brick furnaces, and soot still traced every roof. But something in the city had shifted. The edges had softened, the silences had grown meaningful, and the name Jonathan Markham, once spoken with suspicion in the corridors of power, now echoed in town halls and union meetings as a man transformed, not by scandal, but by the woman who had dared to love him honestly. Lila sat in a draughty parish room, wrapped in a wool cloak, the smell of coal and ink mingling in the air. Before her stood a dozen young apprentices, boys with calloused hands and wide eyes, girls in patched dresses who had been told their futures lived only in laundry lines or factory corners. She read aloud from a manual on safety standards, pausing between paragraphs to translate the technical into the human. "This," she said, tapping the thick page with her gloved finger, "means your work matters. Your life matters. No more hidden costs buried in ledgers. No more blood paid in silence." The room was silent for a breath. Then slowly one hand rose. "Miss Davenport, what if the foreman doesn't care? What if he says we're just lucky to be hired?" She did not smile. She met the boy's question with all the gravity it deserved. "Then you show him your certificate, and you tell him you are part of the Markham Apprenticeship Trust, backed by law, by contract, and by every worker who's come before you and refused to be invisible." That afternoon, the children filed out past her with hesitant pride, their new workbooks clutched like treasures. Behind them, Jonathan appeared in the doorway, snow still dusting the shoulders of his overcoat. His gloves were in one hand, his face touched by fatigue. But when he looked at her, something warm flickered beneath the weariness. "You still terrify me when you speak like that," he said quietly. Lila lifted an eyebrow. "Good. That means you're listening." He crossed the room to her side, offering his arm. "Shall we walk?" She took it without hesitation. Outside, the day was ending in shades of rose and pewter. The sky hung low over the Monongahela, and the gas lamps flickered on with a soft hiss along the snowy sidewalks. The city bustled still, but the air was cleaner now, both literally and figuratively. Several mills had adopted new oversight protocols. The first quarterly inspections had already removed 2 managers and saved one boy from losing a hand. Quiet revolutions, begun not with riots, but with reason. Their boots crunched softly over the snow. A child waved from a bakery window. A widow nodded as she passed, tipping her shawl. "I heard from the East Liberty Cooperative," Jonathan said as they walked. "They want to model their fund on ours. They even asked if you'd come speak to the wives." Lila tucked her chin into her scarf. "Only if they serve strong tea and no flattery." "I warned them." They reached the corner of Grant Street, where the old brick bank building stood, its facade scrubbed clean, its stained glass recently restored. Once, its name had been whispered in courtrooms and behind closed doors. Now it had become a symbol of reluctant reform, largely because its new co-founder did not allow it to forget its past. Inside the foyer hung a modest brass plaque, small, unassuming. It read, "In honor of every hand that shaped this city, but was never invited to own it." Jonathan had insisted on placing it there. Lila had chosen the words. They did not go inside. Instead, they kept walking, down toward the river. The evening air bit at their cheeks, but their pace was steady, their silence comfortable. As they passed the row of townhouses near their own, Lila caught sight of a figure on the porch of the Davenport home. The curtain twitched. A face appeared at the window. Clara. Her sister had returned quietly 3 days earlier. There had been no announcement, no baggage train of gossiping matrons, just one small trunk and a driver paid in advance. She had climbed the steps alone, unlocking the door with a key she had once threatened to throw away. For nearly a week, Clara had moved like a ghost, silent, pale, unadorned. Her pride had not survived Edward Holland's dismissal, nor had her ambitions recovered from watching Lila take a place in society that required neither scheming nor seduction. That morning, Lila had crossed the snowy yard with a covered basket and knocked on the door. Clara had answered in a dressing gown, her hair unpinned for the first time Lila could remember. They had not embraced, but Lila had handed her the shawl, still warm from the hearth, and placed a teacup on the table. "You needn't ask forgiveness," Lila had said, "only rest." Clara had not replied, but she had not closed the door. Now, as Jonathan and Lila passed, the curtain did not move again. "She'll find her way," Lila murmured, almost to herself. Jonathan's hand found hers in the crook of his elbow. "If she has your blood," he said, "she'll rise stronger than before." They reached the edge of the river, where iron bridges stretched like ribs across the icy current. The mills loomed in the distance, their flames flickering beneath the clouds, but something was different. The smoke no longer felt suffocating, the fire no longer seemed cruel. It was not purity, but it was possibility. Lila stopped near a stone ledge, her breath visible in the cold. "When I was a girl," she said, "I used to imagine this city catching fire and vanishing. Every injustice, every greed, every silence burned away." Jonathan stood beside her. "And now, she said, "I think the fire must remain, but it must be seen, controlled, contained, shared." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "I was a coward, Lila, for years." "You were surviving," she answered softly, "but now you're living." He reached for her hand again, gloveless, letting the cold bite both their fingers. "We didn't build a fantasy, did we?" "No," she whispered. "We built a truth." From the streets behind them came the sound of laughter, children chasing one another over icy cobbles, their shouts rising into the night. A lamplighter moved slowly up the street, igniting warmth one flame at a time. Jonathan turned to her. "Do you regret it?" She met his gaze with a steadiness that needed no ornament. "I chose you not because you were easy or even good," she said, "but because you were willing to change, to listen, to stand beside me when I would not be quiet." "That is a rare thing, Jonathan. I will never regret that." He bent his head slightly, not a bow, but a gesture of reverence. "I love you, Lila." "I know," she said. And that too was truth. They turned back toward home, their steps slow but sure. The chimneys still burned, the steel still hissed, but the air had changed, and so had they. In a world where light had once belonged only to chandeliers and drawing rooms, Lila Davenport had placed it where it had always belonged, in the hands of those who built the city, and in the heart of the woman who refused to shrink. Fire had shaped them, but now, at last, it illuminated. It was the end of January, and the snow had come early that year, blanketing the hills of Pittsburgh in silence and memory. The chimneys still smoked, but less now. Some of the mills had long since closed, others had been rebuilt with cleaner technologies, and the old skyline that once screamed of iron and sweat had softened. There was progress here, and cost, and echoes. Inside the schoolhouse that had once been a storage barn for coal, the windows rattled in the wind as a fire snapped in the brick hearth. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, their hands raised, their laughter bright. At the front of the room stood a woman with silver threaded in her dark brown hair, her shoulders cloaked in a shawl hand-woven by widows from the northern districts. "Who can tell me," Lila asked, smiling gently, "what this symbol means?" She held up a copper medallion, stamped with the seal of the Workers' Safety Trust, an emblem that had once hung only in boardrooms, but now lived in homes, schools, and even kitchens. A girl, no older than 7, raised her hand, her eyes shining. "It means we matter." Lila's smile faltered just for a second, not from sadness, but from the weight of it. "That's right," she said softly. "It means you matter." After the lesson, as the children filed out into the snow, scarves crooked, boots mismatched but warm, Lila stood alone for a moment by the window, the cold glass fogged beneath her breath. Outside, Jonathan waited beneath the birch tree with a wool coat pulled over his broad frame and flecks of grey at his temples. In his hands, he held a lunch basket, and in his eyes was that same look he'd given her the night of the winter assembly nearly a decade ago, quiet, unwavering, and full of something that time had only made deeper. They had married without fanfare. No orchestra, no officials, just a promise whispered in the presence of those who had walked beside them through fire. The vows had been real because they had been simple. "8 years later, those vows held still. Through strikes and sickness, through Clara's silence and eventual return, through the sleepless nights when grief for a world too slow to change threatened to hollow them out. Through the days when reform was celebrated and the days when it was spat on, they had endured, they had built. The Markham Davenport Foundation now oversaw apprenticeship programs across 3 counties. Fatal accidents in mills had dropped by over half. Schoolhouses, like the one Lila taught in, had been funded by profit redirected, not as charity, but as justice. And every year in December they hosted a quiet gathering in the parish hall for the families of men who had once gone unnamed. The first names of the lost were now etched in stone in a small garden near the river, where flame-resistant roses bloomed in spring. As for Clara, she lived in a smaller house now, near the edge of the city. After her fall from society, the invitations had stopped, and so had the vanity. But slowly she had begun to mend. She worked now with a local charity that housed displaced girls, helping them sew garments for winter and teaching them how to read ledgers, real ledgers without secrets. She and Lila spoke often. They would never return to the bond they had as children, but something more honest had replaced it. The hard-earned peace between 2 women who had both lost and survived. Mrs. Davenport had passed 3 winters ago. Her final days were quiet, but not lonely. She had seen her daughter become more than anyone expected, not through marriage, but through meaning. On the day of her burial, mill workers lined the road in silence, caps removed, heads bowed. And as for Jonathan and Lila, they had 2 children. A boy named Elias, thoughtful and slow to speak, and a girl named Miriam, wild with questions and curls. They lived in a house near the river, not grand, but warm, with soot still on the bricks, but sunlight in every room. The children knew the stories, of a wedding with no music, of a ledger that changed a city, of a dance that once stopped a room. That night, as the sun dipped low and the snow thickened again, Lila and Jonathan sat on the porch with cups of spiced tea, their children asleep upstairs, their world wrapped in quiet. Jonathan reached for her hand. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The fire?" She turned her face toward the distant skyline, where only a few furnaces glowed now, their light a memory more than a menace. "No," she said after a moment, "because what we built from it is still burning." He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her temple, lingering there as if listening to the heartbeat of the city within her. "I never imagined this life," he whispered. Lila smiled. "I did. I just didn't imagine I'd get to keep it." They sat together like that until the snow blurred the edges of the world, and only the warmth between them remained. The city, once ruled by gold and silence, now breathed easier. And though the fire no longer roared, the light it held. What a journey, dear listener. Lila Davenport's story is more than a romance. It's a testament to quiet courage, to choosing love without illusion, and to standing for what's right, even when the world expects you to shrink. Through soot and sorrow, through betrayal and resilience, Lila showed us that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman speaking calmly in a room full of powerful men. Sometimes it's a hand offered in forgiveness. Sometimes it's a vow whispered in front of those who never had the luxury of being seen. And maybe that's the lesson we carry with us now. That true change doesn't come from spectacle, but from conviction. That dignity isn't given by society. It's claimed by the soul. If this story moved you, if it stirred something quiet and powerful inside you, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear what you felt, what you learned, and what stayed with you. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word unshaken in the comments, so we know you're one of those who stayed with us through every snowfall, every choice, every chapter. If you'd like to support the small but passionate team that brings these stories to life, you can now send a super thanks right here on YouTube, with whatever amount your heart feels is right. It helps us continue crafting these emotional, richly detailed journeys that honor women like Lila and voices often left in the shadows. But if you can't support financially, there's still a beautiful way to help. Share this story with someone who needs to remember what grace under fire looks like. Or explore other unforgettable tales we've prepared for you. Just check the cards we've left on screen. There's always another story waiting, another heart ready to be stirred. From our hearts to yours, thank you for walking through the snow with us.